Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual vASN, Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University, Canada. And I'm here to welcome everyone to this event, which focuses on Borderlands, providing perspectives from leading scholars about how they think of cross-border politics, particularly as it impacts nation building and identities. I'd like to thank our panelists, Doctors Alina Jašina-Schäfer, Kristina Kallas, Mylonas, Myra, Waterbury, for sharing their thoughts in what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion. Special thanks to Dr. Myra Waterbury for putting together the panel, together with our expert moderator, Dr. Angela Kachuyevski. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today, which is the day before the one-year anniversary, so to speak, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The vASN community strongly condemns Russia's aggression, and this condemnation represents the views of the largest scholarly community in the field of nationalism and ethnicity studies. I don't want to belabor the point about the significance of the questions discussed here today against the backdrop of this war. We are thankful for the opportunity to have these conversations in a free virtual space under the norms of academic freedom. Our panelists bring a wealth of research-based knowledge to the discussion, including comparative research involving the large European and Eurasian part of the world and beyond. And I don't want to take up more of their time. I will now give the virtual floor to our expert moderator, Dr. Angela Kachuyevski. She is an associate professor of political science at Arcadia University in suburban Philadelphia. And over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much. Thanks to welcome to all of our attendees, and thank you so much to our wonderful panel. I will introduce briefly our panelists in order of presentation. We have Alina Jašina-Schäfer, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Federal Institute for Culture and History of the Germans in East Europe in Oldenburg. We have Kristina Kallas, who is a research fellow at Tartu University Narva College. Myra Waterbury is professor of political science at Ohio University. And Mylonas is associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University and editor-in-chief of Nationalities Papers. Welcome to all, and we will turn over to Alina to start us off.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to join the discussion. I hope you can hear me. So I would like to start my talk with a premise that also with Borderlands as shifting kaleidoscope of lives helps us to expose the complex nature of people's multiple inhabitants. And here I borrow the term from the recent book by Hassan Hage that is called The Diasporic Condition. As we have noticed, recent events in many ways demonstrate the unfinished nature of spatial reconfiguration in the borderlands that have been ongoing since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But they also show us the changing socioeconomic and cultural networks, also the existing tensions that continue to exist due to complex history of entanglements within and also across the former Soviet republics. Now, there are many different ways of how we could approach the processes of transformation, and Borderlands could be studied on the one hand, for example, as political projects with different competing visions and imaginaries. But today I would like to talk about my own research in which I particularly focused on people's everyday perspectives and experiences. That is, how people inhabit borderlands, how they are affected by spatial reconfigurations. And these questions can be also extended to more general questions of, for example, what is the time of the borderlands and what is the place of the borderlands also in the imaginaries of individuals? And subsequently, what these different understandings mean for their senses of belonging. Here, I would like to refer briefly to the experiences of Russian speakers in the borderland city of Narva in Estonia and Petropavlovsk in Kazakhstan. The research I conducted lies a few years back now, 2016, 2017. And of course, there have been drastic changes that we need to consider. On the one hand, there was a pandemic, still is. And on the other hand, the war that created numerous shifts and emergent lines of conflict in the borderlands. But I think that many aspects of life still prevail, and many points that I would like to raise are still worth considering. So I would like to start first with the experiences of time. The everyday life in the borderlands show us foremost the coexistence of multiple temporalities that are competing, that are clashing, and they are also productive of different visions that exist of the present and also hopes of the future. So in contrast to the official state attempts to abandon and also to forget certain Soviet experiences, which are incompatible with or even considered as threatening to national identity narratives, if we look at the individual perspective, the past is not always considered a constraint. Rather, it is a source from which people draw to navigate reconfigurations of life and also to articulate the otherwise denied and silenced concerns with the present. And it is also, or the past is also a source to contrast oneself from the others and also to attempt to stabilize and undermine social boundaries. So if we look at the plot lines of people, we can trace different competing interpretation of these pasts. So on the one hand, people use an ordinary understanding of time as that of building personal careers, as building families and relationships. On the other hand, past is referred to as a particular time of sociability. And the past is also a time of progress and prosperity, which arises in comparison to today's images of decline. But for others, time or past is a time of insecurity and uncertainty. Now, these different temporal interpretations are central in placemaking strategies and in the way people understand their spatial environments. And this is also how borderlands are imagined in terms of transnational, translocal, and global perspective. And here I'd like to draw a few examples also from my field work and how, for example, Narva was experienced and imagined. On the one hand, it appeared as a kind of a city where several mental spaces at once coexist. In some instances, it was represented as an existential sense of dislocation, a disappearing non-place, as one person put it, that is assigned to a secondary position in Estonia. In other instances, it was reconstructed as a historically Estonian, modern, and inherently Western place. In others yet, the city was Russian, with Russian as carrying a heterogeneous meaning, often detached from the Russian state itself. And what I found surprising is that sometimes Russian state was even, or Russian people, devalued as barbaric. In Petropavlovsk, in contrast, the plural cultural mosaic that was inscribed into the urban states by the state authorities themselves and city planners reverberated, of course, in diverse perceptions of Russian speakers themselves, who then reconstructed the city as this kind of fragmented universe of meaning. So on the one hand, some describe the city as a Russian-speaking space, which is legitimately dominated by Russian language and culture, and simultaneously stands for people's sense of out-of-placement in the country. But on the other hand, life in Petropavlovsk was intimately connected with practices of Kazakh culture and habits of life in Kazakhstan, while people's multiple aspirations were connected then with the idea of a global city. Now, what can these different imaginaries and experiences of people tell us about their senses of belonging? The weaving of different temporalities and spatialities is often often leads to people being considered as in between, as being ambivalent subjects. Previous studies, for example, have frequently noted how the retraction of the Soviet borders pushed the Russophone population into an area of being neither here nor there, no longer entirely other, not yet fully a part of a new nation or of a new nation state. So they became so-called threshold people that occupy a transitory phase to new statuses and positionalities. And following initial paths of detachment and marginality in the 90s, some Russian speakers are believed to have entered the paths towards integration or have become fully integrated subjects, while others hang on to this existential idea of outsidedness. In my research and also here, however, I'd like to argue that people exist in multiple realities simultaneously, as rather than being in between. They position themselves as exterior and interior to a variety of different places simultaneously, continuously moving between what is considered as foreign and also on the one hand, and what is considered domestic and interior on the other. And these positionalities coexist and complement each other and take change also under the weight of the socio-political and global forces. So to think with a lens of multiple inhabitants means also a thorough understanding how people crisscross boundaries and how they draw on different spaces and times to position themselves. And to summarize this process, I would like to turn to one of my interlocutors, who in her narratives frequently reconstructed Narva as a separate world of freaks, where she herself considered as being one of those freaks. She spoke of it as a heavy emotional load that fell on her through socio-political reconfigurations of the city and images of Russian speakers as related to otherness in general. But on the other occasions, she reappeared as a European and a modern subject, and her belonging to a more civilized space was secured against the perceived backwardness of Russia and Russians. On other occasions yet, she also inhabited and consumed the world of Russia, claiming historical, linguistic, and cultural links to it. Now, to conclude my points, I would like to note that the war in Ukraine exposed further the differential modes of being and the fragmentation that I have spoken about. But this fragmentation pertains not only to the different realities that people exist within, but also to the very self itself. And to return to Hassan Hage, with whom I started, it is not only that the person is existing within multiple realities, but that the very person, the very I, is now torn. What we can take from this in terms of future research, in my opinion, it necessitates a more critical approach towards communities, which remains quite a flourishing concept, especially in diasporic and migration studies. And in terms of Russian speakers, we need to be critically aware that despite the language and culture, there is no strong sense of community, but rather a fragmented network of people, whose intensities of association with places and times are changing, and some of whom are experiencing quite a violent tearing apart of these different realities. And I will conclude on that, and I'm looking forward to comments and discussion on these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, for that wonderful presentation. It's terrific. I'll turn my video back on. Apologies. Thank you so much, Alina. That was a really wonderful presentation. Kristina.
Thank you. Thank you also for the invitation to speak on that webinar. I will continue from where Alina started. So I will also be talking about the borderlands with Russia, mostly Estonia and Latvia, where the Russian-speaking population in numbers is quite significant. And what I will focus today on is the question of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has affected those borderland populations. As you might know, there is about 30% of population in Estonia as well as in Latvia that consider themselves to be Russian speakers. You have majority of them ethnic Russians, but you also have some other ethnic groups of the former Soviet Union represented. However, what unites them together is to some extent the common migration history during the Soviet time, and also the Russian language spoken at home, and also not only home, but also in public and in schools. This population has been in academic world the focus of interest since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there are approximately around 20 million Russian speakers outside of current Russian Federation territory who live in the former Soviet republics, and the Russia's compatriot policy towards them and towards the former Soviet Republic countries has been of a very big focus during the academic debates in the last 30 years. And obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine raises the big question, what is happening, or what is happening in the heads of minds of the Russians in other countries around Russia, and also how this invasion affects those Russian-speaking populations. The discussion I will have today for 10 minutes is the results of the research that we did together since the February 2022 with my good colleagues Zsuzsa Cergo, who is here as well at this webinar, and Tamás Kis from Hungary, because we were comparing Hungarian securitization of Hungarian minorities and securitization of the Russian-speaking minorities in Central Eastern Europe. The starting point of my intervention here in this seminar is 24th of February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine clearly and bluntly, and although the war has been happening there for a long time already, but this invasion was especially brutal, and it was very difficult to say that there is no invasion happening, especially considering how clearly the information has been on board. So the Russian-speaking population of Estonia and Latvia obviously were in a situation where they were, where they in the shock situation when this event happened. What followed to that among the Russian-speaking population? Well, the first reactions came obviously from the political leaders of the Russian-speaking population, and these reactions were very swift, surprisingly very swift, immediate, on the same day when the invasion happened, and they were very much pro-Ukrainian and condemning the Russian aggression towards Ukraine. To some observers, academic observers, that was surprising, that these political leaders of the Russian-speaking populations took very swift and immediate response in support of Ukraine and condemnation of the Russian invasion, because in 2014, 8 years previous to that, when Russia annexed Crimea, the reaction was not so clear. The reaction of Russian-speaking leaders was much more soft on the edges, saying that these referendums in Crimea are not probably legal. However, and there was always however, saying that the population of Crimea was probably most willing to join the Russia, and that's something that should be also considered. So in February 2022, the Russian leadership in Estonia as well as in Latvia took very swift and immediate stance condemning the Russian invasion. At the same time, on the meso level, on the more local level, when we talk about the local politicians, locally elected, as well as, for example, Russian school directors and other local community leaders, the response was more silent. What we could observe was that there was not very strong statements emanating, and rather the local level leaders preferred not to comment or express any of their own opinions on that situation. And that created, after some time, a securitization debate in Estonian society, when you could see that to the silence of the local leaders in some local communities, for example, in Daugavpils in Latvia, where you have a significant Russian-speaking population, in the leaders of the community in Narva, which is in Estonia, which is a fully Russian-speaking, of Sillamäe, Kohtla-Järve, and also some local political leaders in Latvia capital, Riga. So their silence and their unwillingness, or maybe maybe carefulness in expressing their opinions regarding the Russian invasion triggered at some point the reactions from ethnic Estonian political leaders. And that's the moment, or Latvian ethnic political leaders, and that's the moment where we started seeing actually the heavy securitization of the Russian minority as such. How do this securitization happened? Starting from the March last year, there were many political decisions taken by the governments of Latvia and Estonia that curtailed or diminished significantly the rights of the Russian speakers in Estonia and Latvia. The first immediate reaction was banning all Russian television screening on Estonian territory. In Latvia, that was done already earlier. In Estonia, on the morning of the 24th of February, the government made a decision of banning all Russian TV from the Russia, screening from Russia. Second, the immediate debate started about removing the monuments, Soviet time monuments. There are not so many of them left, but there are still some Soviet time monuments left in the public spaces, and especially in the communities where the Russians form a majority. So whether this is Riga, Daugavpils, or Narva, Kohtla-Järve, and Sillamäe. So you got this reaction from the Estonian political leaders who started pushing for removal of the all remaining monuments, and it became heavily politicized and kind of conflictual event in Narva when the tank or Soviet tank T-34 was eventually by the end of the summer forcefully removed from its position in Narva. And the second incident of such was removal of the big Soviet obelisk in the middle of the city of Riga, where you also had protests and reactions to that. The third very quick reaction was the reaction about the celebrations of the 9th of May, or so to say, Victory Day, which Russians have had as a tradition for years to celebrate, to commemorate the fallen grandfathers and grandmothers in the Second World War, especially those who were fighting on the Red Army battalions. And the reaction from Latvian government was very strict by banning all kind of gatherings and celebrations of those events in the center city of Riga. So basically sending a very clear message to the Russian-speaking community about that this kind of celebrations are not any longer welcome on the territory of Latvia. Estonian government reacted a little bit more mildly, however, still sending signals saying that you can gather, this is okay, but you are not allowed to use any of the symbols connected to the current Russian government or the Russian regime, whether this is the St. George ribbons or Z signs or any other signs. So yet basically the message was to the Russian community that your gathering has to only concentrate on commemoration of your fallen comrades or grandfathers and grandmothers, but there should be no connection whatsoever celebrating current Russian regime and its connection to the events. Now, the next big steps, both in Latvia and Estonia, was political debates connected to the residence and voting rights of the Russian Federation citizens, because both countries still have a significant part of the population that are Russian Federation citizens. In Estonia, the debate is still going on and the decision is not made to withdraw the voting rights of the Russian Federation citizens on local elections. In Latvia, that's not a debate because Russian Federation citizens do not have voting rights in the local elections. In Estonia, they do. And there are political parties pushing for, Estonian ethnic political parties pushing for the withdrawal of the voting rights from the Russian Federation citizens. And obviously that securitizes Russian-speaking population quite heavily. However, in order for, in reality, this to happen, to withdraw the voting rights, Estonia would need to go through the constitution, change of the constitution, and that's much more complicated. So it's currently more on a political rhetorical level rather than the real actions, because the real actions would require a national referendum. If not national referendum, then the voting of 2 consecutive parliaments. And I think that's not actually even feasible, because there are at least 2 parties, strong parties in parliament, who are objecting that stance. And last but not least, the most important or biggest switch that is happening to the Russian rights or the possibilities of the Russian-speaking population in those two countries as a result of the invasion is that in both countries, the parliaments voted for the 100% transfer of Russian schools into the Estonian language or Latvian language of instruction. In case of Latvia, this has been a process going on for many, many years. And now the decision was extremely strict, in my opinion, because the Russian language is fully banned from the education system, including private schools that are not allowed to teach in Russian. And Russian language as such can be taught as a mother tongue under extracurricular activities. So it's not even part of any official national school curricula. So this is quite severe decision by basically eliminating Russian language from the Latvian education system fully from the kindergarten up to higher education. In case of Estonia, the decision is milder, softer. There is in the law, which was adopted in October, saying that the Russian schools have to start transferring, not yet transfer fully, but start transferring from 2024 into Estonian language of instruction. There is a period of 7 years when they would need to change, but it's not so strict in terms of completely banning Russian language from the education system. There is still an opportunities under this current new law to teach Russian or even teach in Russian, but they are severely limited compared to what it was before the invasion. So these are the political steps that the governments and the parliaments of the two Baltic states have taken vis-a-vis the current rights and possibilities of the current Russian population. And what is the most significant thing about it is that there is no significant protest from the side of the Russian community. So this kind of attempts to switch the language of instruction, to discuss the removal of the monuments, to ban the Russian TV has been happening also before. This is nothing new, but in previous years, this created a quite strong mobilization of the Russian population and the protest against this. This has not happened this time. And we can see how the Russian population also feels itself strongly securitized and is very much afraid to mobilize around the Russian issues, because this will immediately be considered as an unpatriotic act and act of unloyalty. And we have had instances in both countries, in Estonia and in Latvia, where Russian Federation citizens who have been openly protesting and supporting Putin's regime have been extradited to Russia, have been sent out of the country. Even people who have been born and lived all their life in Estonia, but being a Russian citizen and having openly pro-Russia Federation regime stances and spreading those stances have resulted in sending them out of the country to Russia. So to conclude my speech here is that the war, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine has very heavily securitized the realities of the Russian-speaking population in the two Baltic states. And the outcome of this is that Russians have lost any democratic agency they would otherwise have under the democratic system to mobilize for their own interests, whether this is linguistic or ethnic, cultural or religious. I didn't even mention actually the religious issue, because there is also the Orthodox Church connection to the Moscow Patriarchate, which has also been heavily securitized and become an issue. So differently from 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea, where the situation in Estonia and Latvia was rather, the reaction was rather mild towards the Russian-speaking population. The current reaction of the majority Estonian government and Estonian population has been very heavily securitizing the realities and basically stripping the Russian population of democratic agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina. That was a fascinating, very timely presentation. I'd like to note, please, for our attendees, we will be beginning a question and answer period after our presentations conclude, but please feel free to use the Q&A function to add your questions beginning now, if you like. Myra?
Great, thank you. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to think through some of my my own questions about how to conceptualize the broader understanding of kin-state politics and policies, which has been sort of where my research has been throughout most of my career, and to think through that specifically within the context of what has been happening in Ukraine. So this is not, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine, but I'm just going to start a little bit with and use and expand upon some of my arguments in my 2020 State of the Field article on nationalities papers about kin-state politics, and to think a little bit conceptually about to what extent this is a good framework to understand Russia's actions in and towards Ukraine. So to discuss a little bit about what we mean or what we should mean by kin-state politics and policies and dynamics, what we think we know and what we don't know, and then, you know, again, with an eye towards thinking conceptually about whether this is a framework that is useful to understand what's going on in Ukraine. So in terms of what do we mean by kin-state politics and policies, in my State of the Field article, I write that the term kin-state, quote, refers to a state that represents the majority nation of a trans-border ethnic group whose members reside in neighboring territories. Kin states actively cultivate ties to external members of that group based on shared cultural and national kinship and take on a role in the protection and preservation of their external kin. So to break, you know, relatedly, we could think of kin-state policies and politics as characterized by an institutionalized cross-border relationship between actors and policymakers in one state and members of a national minority residing in another, usually neighboring state. And then if we break down some of that broader definition into some of the assumptions behind it, I think I thought of sort of three things. One is that this is based clearly on a previous historical or political relationship of a kin state to territory in which the minority resides. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. Second is to imagine that this involves a set of policies developed as an alternative to military intervention and irredentism. And again, this is an issue that I wrote about in my State of the Field article, but I think has some important implications for the moment we're living in right now. So these all, you know, thinking about a field of things that we call kin-state policies, driven by kin-state politics, again, developed as a way to understand things that weren't military intervention and irredentism, including lobbying and advocacy, you know, buying multilateral treaty protections, providing support for minority cultural, political, even economic institutions and forms of political membership, like citizenship, voting rights, special access to residency or the labor market, even welfare state benefits. So, and then the kind of the third assumption underlying this understanding of kin-state politics is that sort of in the spirit of Rogers Brubaker, that the development of kin-state policies and the impact of kin-state politics are relational in that they require at least some meaningful act of reciprocity by the members of the minority communities on whose behalf these policies are created. So we must take into account minority agency, you know, which Kristina was just talking about, and the impact on those communities, and also involves the interest and response of the state in which the minority lives. Again, we just heard some examples of that from Kristina, which impacts interstate relations and regional stability, and potentially this idea of securitization, as well as the overall political and social position of the minority communities. So moving to what we think, or I think we know about kin-state dynamics, kin-state politics and policies. So I think there is somewhat of a consensus that the intensity and sort of specific content of kin-state policies or postures at any given moment in time are shaped to a large degree by domestic and foreign policy interests of the kin-state. So again, this idea that kin-state actors are not necessarily driven solely by deep-seated feelings of ethnic affiliation. However, this does not mean that kin-state politics should be seen as purely instrumental, meaning that we should understand the overall kin-state commitment to be ongoing, institutionalized, and broadly meaningful to various constituencies on both sides of the border. And I think, again, I think some of sort of the straw man version of some of my earlier work kind of highlighted the instrumental argument that I made about the relationship of kin-state politics to domestic politics. But I also don't think I ever meant to imply that there wasn't sort of this ongoing institutionalized commitment that was meaningful to people. And I think this brings into question then whether a state's use of an existing kin minority across the border as a justification for military aggression should be considered as an extreme case of kin-state politics, or should it be considered as something else entirely? So that's one of the things I've been thinking about. We also know that the relationship between kin states and kin minorities or local kin majorities is often quite complicated, and that we cannot assume that all members of the minority community relate to kin state support and identity in the same way. And I think Alina's presentation highlighted that very nicely. So that kin state policies can both expand opportunities and also create problems for minority political agency and community cohesion. Again, good examples were given by Kristina's discussion of what's been happening with Russian speakers in the Baltics. So we should be wary of discourse and actions from both sides of the border that seek to impose a homogenizing narrative about the interests, identities, and needs of the minority community and its relationship to both the kin state and to its state of residence. So and again, thinking about the current context, I think this is a particularly difficult thing to do during a time of war, is to sort of find that nuance and to separate out the complexity from kind of these totalizing narratives that are ongoing. So to move to what we don't know, I think there's kind of three large questions that I want to address here. I think there's probably more that we don't know, but this is not meant to be comprehensive, just sort of, conceptual and maybe a bit provocative. So first is, how much kin state support then is too much? What kinds of kin state actions may lead to a dangerous securitization of minorities? And then how worried in general should we be about kin state politics and policies? And so here I suggest that these questions are simultaneously too simplistically easy and too difficult to answer if we include a case like Russia's military actions, and it basically is interventions into Ukraine since 2014 under this analytical umbrella. So too simplistically easy because one answer is that we know too much, too dangerous from the perspective of kin state politics when we see it, which would be when it leads to military intervention or irredentism or war. But too difficult in some ways because, including Russia in that universe of cases when it involves these kinds of policies may force us to be too alarmist and overlook the nuances of what is potentially problematic about how, for example, a country like Hungary has operated as a kin state over the past decade or so. So if we expand out to the most extreme outcomes, then we lose our ability to see the totality of the broader universe of sort of kin state policy dynamics. So again, back to this question about whether we see Russia's actions as a difference of degree in terms of kin state intervention in kin state politics, or a difference of type, meaning, a completely different animal that kind of excludes it from this analytical universe of cases. As to how much kin state support policies dynamic is too much, as I've suggested elsewhere, for example, in my 2021, I believe, article on divided nationhood and multiple membership, too much kin state support may be when an overwhelming and totalizing project of kin state projection into minority communities constrains the ability of minority actors to negotiate with their own states and creates relationships of dependency and hegemony with the kin state, as I and others have argued, has happened at least to some point with some of Hungary's policies since 2010. And then the question of securitization, which Kristina already went into, and then if we look at whether the Russian war in Ukraine has securitized both sort of kin state politics and policies, as well as national minorities more generally, Clearly, there are cases when it has, but I think as kind of an overall statement, the trend seems to be that securitization has only been significant when it's coupled with other troubling moves by an aggressive kin state outside of sort of the Russian speakers in the Baltics, which are sort of directly connected to the war itself. So, for example, the Hungarian government's reluctance to support Ukraine against Russia explicitly, the reemergence of sort of Hungarian irredentist symbology of late, some worrying discourse from the fringes of the Fidesz right has fed into rumors about whether Hungary would use the war as an opportunity to sort of reclaim Transcarpathia. And this is certainly concerning, but I think beyond some discursive moves by the sort of usual nationalist subjects, this does not seem to have shifted dynamics much for the Hungarian minority in Slovakia, Romania, or Serbia. And in part, this may be because the budgetary realities in the shadow of the war have forced a country like Hungary to pull back from some of its financial commitments to kin state support. So there may be some evidence of policy contraction rather than expansion as a result of the war and its larger consequences in Europe. And secondly, while many European actors are greatly concerned about kin state actions leading to bi rather than multilateralization of minority rights, sort of based on the principle that minority rights should be protected by these kind of European level or international level minority rights treaties, and based on the principle that states of residence should provide rights and opportunities to minorities, it seems that many previously nationalizing states have now come to accept at least a degree of kin state intervention on their territory, and in fact may be content to outsource the protection and promotion of national minorities to an active kin state. So I think, again, this shifts some of the earlier aspects of what we were worried about, right? So for a number of reasons, I would argue that kin state dynamics are broadly relevant to the context of what may come to shape a post-war Ukraine's relationship to its internal minorities, but that Russia's actions towards Ukraine maybe cannot or should not be usefully analyzed through the lens of kin state politics, lest we allow ourselves to be both too alarmist and too broad about how we think about kin state politics and policies. So thank you.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you. Thank you. Harris, last but not least.
Thank you. So as expected, a lot has been covered by these wonderful presentations. So I think I'll kind of pick up sort of where Myra left the conversation on this. I was going to present some of her own definitions, so I don't have to do that now. I think my talk is going to be a little bit more bird's eye view on the topic, although I will refer to the cases, meaning I'm not an expert so much on the regions that are being talked about directly, although the Balkans that I study has had its own fair share and still does of kin state politics. Although understandably the focus now is primarily on Russia's invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine. So I'll start with a big picture. First of all, that we have 193 United Nations member states in the world. And as we speak, sovereignty is being challenged and contested by stateless nationalist movements, anti-regime guerrillas, sometimes by what we call de facto states. And in all these phenomena that we often talk about in political science, we implicate kin state politics very often in these challenges to state sovereignty. So again, to build on what Myra was saying, this would be what's called securitized, or what I would call when kin state politics takes an irredentist turn, let's say. And there is no doubt that Putin put a very clear irredentist framework in trying to legitimate or justify or even explain for some why he's doing what he's doing. So the irredentist variety of kin state politics is undeniably existing. Now, whether we're going to stop using that terminology for that type of endeavor or approach to kin state politics will not change the fact that this is happening, right? So we can decide to do whatever we want with our terms, but it will still be something to be worth studying, I think. So regardless of the intentions behind kin state involvement and active interest for the fate of the kin group abroad from a state of residence perspective, any external meddling, I would argue, is often seen as a threat. So to take it a step further, in other words, even in the cases that can be presented by scholars like Myra and I as cultural affairs or innocuous, oftentimes we have found, both of us, I think we have found in our research, states often perceive even what is purely cultural or non-irredentist as often a potential threat or challenge to their territorial integrity. Now, whether that should be perceived as that or not, obviously, I think Myra and I agree it shouldn't, but it often does, or at least it's framed this way. And that brings us closer to how securitization theory has been talking about these things, not purely the irredentist, actual irredentist variety, right, Myra, but rather this perception or framing of kin state politics as a security threat. So even at that level, we need to think of whether that is just a scale we should start thinking about, where we can think of kin state politics that are not thought by the state of residence at all as a security threat, even in a perception perspective. Irredentist politics being on the actual extreme that Myra talked about, the acting upon it and militarily acting upon it. And then kin state politics that are completely kind of bilateral relations level, cultural exchanges and so on and so forth. So that's one way of maybe creating a spectrum of securitization or if you want, militarization, if you want, of this affair, or threatening degree of threat perception, let's say. Now, not all types of kin state politics challenges, as we said, state sovereignty. Myra, in her own work, has put it very nicely. I think there is this gray area of kin state politics, as she says in the 2020 piece, between challenging state sovereignty and protecting the rights of culturally distinct groups. But a lot can exist in between there. Kin state politics have often taken the form of cultural affairs. As we said, for instance, in much of Central and East Europe, kin state politics involves the right of kin groups to establish and maintain ties with their kin states, but not challenge the territorial sovereignty of the state of residence. And a lot of people on this panel have worked on this type of cases. Moreover, the rights of kin states, of a kin state, extends to the transborder kin group, but in those cases that I just mentioned in East and Central Europe, those must be approved by the state of residence. That's an important caveat here, and align with its institutional framework. That's where we can start seeing how a clear line is being drawn between those that are normalized, let's say, somehow in terms of interstate relations, and the ones that are not in that category. Of course, European organizations were trying to prevent the irredentist variety of kin state politics within the European Union, and after the big expansion of 2014 of the European Union, a lot of these things that had the irredentist potential, a lot of these relationships that had the irredentist potential, I would argue in this talk, started becoming it started becoming possible because of geopolitical changes, I would say, to see them from this institutionalized framework, the Venice Commission framework or OSCE framework, right? And we have much more able people to talk about these initiatives on this panel than me. So moreover, another thing to remind ourselves is that kin states are not all alike. So to begin with, I would argue not all kin states operate as kin states. So not all states that fit the category analytically of what we would call a kin state, potential kin state, let's say, they don't all act as kin states. The same way that I've often said about Brubaker's framework, not all homelands operate as homelands. So regardless of what term you use, there's variation in timing and circumstances under which these kind of actors act in that role. Beyond that, variation, there is variation in terms of agency. For example, Turkey practically built a de facto state in northern Cyprus following the 1974 invasion, but it has not always controlled the internal dynamics there over time. So even the agency of someone who has been pretty clearly hands-on in acting as a king state or a quintessential king state has not had the same capability or ability or even willingness sometimes to have influence. Hungary and Romania, as we know from your own work, Myra, but also Udrea's work, have been engaging in king-state politics with a wide range of policies being implemented over time. So there is variation even in what you're trying to achieve, right? Also, in some cases, the king-state can even annex a territory if it's truly redentist, right? As the Russian Federation has done with Crimea and other parts of Eastern Ukraine right now, or at least it's trying to do, we should say. Which it claims it's inhabited by co-ethnics, and of course, you know, President Putin has gone as far as denying the right of Ukrainians to exist as an independent nation, as we've seen, and that's quintessentially a nationalist type of argument he's trying to make, and we shouldn't shy away as nationalism scholars that he's making. How much he believes it or not, we can have a discussion at the Q&A, and whether that's a true, you know, motivation or not, and so on and so forth. Turning to king groups now, their interest in having a king state intervene also varies tremendously, as we know by work by Alina and Pogoni and others. So they could be wary of their king state, as the Russophones we heard in Estonia, as the work by Kallas has shown us, or even negatively predisposed, as we've seen work by Nina Kaspersen and others. So there is tremendous variation on all fronts here. I know I may sound like we shouldn't study, you know, it's too many moving parts, but I'm saying there are many ways we can unpack this, and I know a lot of people on the panel and in the audience have done that, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. Finally, I would say king-state politics, especially in this terminology, have not been equally present around the world. The term is almost exclusively, if you do a Google search in a way, used in studies concerning Europe and the post, or at least the regimes and states that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So we don't find this term being used as much in other parts of the world. There would be similar terms or similar dynamics, but they wouldn't be framed in that way. Moreover, in terms of timing, the term takes off in the 1990s. It's actually hardly used before. So following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of Yugoslavia, we see a lot of these well-known case studies and studies in general of this phenomenon. However, obviously, the influence of the actual phenomenon kind of dovetails well with Myra's discussion about what should we do with the terminology. Similarly, even the places that don't use this terminology may be benefiting from these analytical frameworks in other parts, right? So we do have some cross-national statistical analysis, not that many. I mean, obviously, Seidman and Ayers and Sederman and some David Sirocki and others have done some of these studies. But again, the conversation between the case study or medium women analysis and this cross-national analysis have not been always as productive as they could be, to put it that way. Now, finally, I don't want to take too much time. I would say, from my perspective, again, not surprisingly, I'll have a nation-building perspective to this. King-state politics, I would say, often appear in tandem or, in terms of timing, around the same time with nation-building campaigns when nation-building takes place. Thus, I would argue that parts of the world that have not experienced nation-building or have experienced incomplete nation-building may be less likely to experience what we call, strictly speaking, king-state politics because of the way we define king-state politics, not because they don't have similar dynamics of cross-border relations and so forth, or cross-border issues with groups that may not be framing their identification in kin type of terminology. Maybe it's religious, maybe it's cultural, maybe it's tribal, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't apply similar logics in those contexts, because we're speaking about more or less similar dynamics. So there is a terminological issue here that may be preventing us who study this space that we study to see similar dynamics in Ethiopia or in Kenya or Somaliland, just because they're not discussed in those fronts, right? Finally, I think I'm going to skip. I mean, my main argument that I'm developing in a volume that Zsuzsa, Udrea, and David Smith are co-editing is about how I think geopolitical dynamics can potentially explain the question that Myra was asking, in the sense that I think the polarity in the international system, whether we're in a unipolar world, multipolar world, or bipolar world, as the Cold War was usually discussed, has something to say or can help us understand where we are more likely to see redentist versions of these politics and where we're less likely to see it. But I'll let everybody read this in print form, so I won't take more of your time. So I'm open to discuss more of this in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harris. What a great panel. Really, really wonderful presentations. I'm going to just say a couple of words just that are coming off the top of my head, having listened to these wonderful presentations. And we have several questions in the chat that I think we can turn to and then maybe head back into an interactive conversation. These different perspectives coming together to offer a really, I think, nuanced, sophisticated way to conceptualize these kinds of political developments that we see happening right now. And, you know, when we have a case where borders, identity borders don't match geographic borders, and we have subsequent challenges to sovereignty, it can lead to cases of securitization of culture, right? So where kin states could be promoting minority rights and playing a positive role in protecting identity, we see that this sometimes is securitized. And this is especially the case when it comes to Russia. And Russia is a special case. Is it a kin state or not? I think that's a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate Myra bringing that up. You know, Russia has the Russian World Project, in which it purports to be a kin state. But of course, this is problematic because technically they're not, Ukrainians are actually Ukrainians. These aren't, right? These aren't necessarily kin. So we have the case in Ukraine that Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the main are Ukrainian identity since Maidan. But yet for Russia to sort of make the argument that this is actually, that Ukraine is not an actual state, it's really part of Russia, I think is an attempt to legitimize their actions and make it look as if they might be seen as a kin state. So just a couple of things that I'm hoping our conversation can capture. I really would like to see what we think about securitization and the possibility of desecuritization in these neighboring countries, because the Russian language has been seen as, you know, sort of dividing the societies. And again, in the Baltic states, it's quite different from Ukraine because language is associated with a separate ethnicity, but language is starting to play a very different role. And I know it's too early to expect anyone to have strong answers on that, but questions about how the war might be able to help desecuritize, if that is a possibility, impact on the sense of belonging, you know, and if we see any sort of possibility for change in the area based upon that. But before we develop that further, I'm going to jump in because we've got 8 questions. We've got 8 questions. First question is for Kristina. Kristina, thank you for the excellent overview. Could you expand on your last point about the securitization of the Russian Orthodox Church in both nations?
Yes, thank you. Actually, the debate on possible desecuritization of the Russian minority in the Baltic states is very intriguing and interesting, I think, but I do agree that it's a bit too early to debate this. But talking about the Orthodox Church, I'm not that much familiar of the processes happening in Latvia. What happened in Estonia was that after the Patriarch Kirill, this is all Patriarch of Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, blessed Russian army and Russian soldiers and said that those who are fighting for Russian motherland in Ukraine will be saved in heaven. And this was, of course, heavy political statement from the church leader that immediately prompted the Estonian reaction to the local Patriarch of Yevgeny, asking what is his position, whether he is the one who has to follow the Patriarch Kirill's Orthodox religious statements or not. And the Estonian public, as well as Minister of Interior, was even threatening Patriarch Yevgeny to strip of his residence permit unless he makes a clear statement that he is detaching himself from the political statements of the Patriarch Kirill in Moscow. And obviously for the Patriarch here in Tallinn, it was difficult, because by not subordinating to the head of the church, you could reach to the point of the church split and all the consequences coming from that. So for several months there was pressure on him, and he had to be publicly constantly putting out his political statements. He was trying to do it very carefully, but eventually he came out with a clear political statement when he distanced himself from the Patriarch Kirill. And with that, he basically saved his residence permit in Estonia. So in this sense, that's how the church got involved in the political matters and was politicized and at the same time securitized, saying that unless you so in a way, church was not allowed to stay silent on the matter any longer, because Patriarch Kirill chose not to stay silent on the matter. And also the church was given a clear signal here that unless you make a political statement, we will ban your activities on the territory of Estonian state. So this is the example how the Orthodox Church got caught into the reality of the invasion.
Thank you, Kristina. We've got a question for Alina. Dear Alina, I find your concept of multiple realities very interesting. Could you please elaborate on how this concept could help us better understand the actions of states in those borderlands, for instance, Russia and Crimea, Lugansk and Donetsk?
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, the concept of multiple inhabitants, I mean, it's not as such my concept. I'm being inspired by the book of Kazan Haag, as I mentioned at the beginning. But related to and answering to your question, I think maybe it does not so much help us to understand the actions of the states or the Russian state in particular, but it helps us to understand the relation of people towards these actions and also the strategies of the people living in these areas, meaning, for example, how people position themselves in relation to the states like Russia, which aspects people decide to alienate or distance themselves from or disentangle themselves from, and also which aspects they rather draw on. So, and I think this also helps us to understand in some ways what Kristina talked about about the kind of narrowing down of public space due to the securitization of Russian speakers, because it helps us to see the different strategies that people are employing to overcome this narrowing space. And in case of Estonia, actually, it's quite interesting. While there are not so many, well, actually no public spaces where the discussions about Russianness are happening, there are, more locally based or more bottom-up agencies of people that you could also look at, where people are trying to overcome this securitization. For example, there are Russian-speaking podcasts that are appearing now also in response to the war in Ukraine, where people are trying to gain their voices, to demonstrate what it means to be a Russian speaker in Estonia. And in that regard, I think this multiple realities or not multiple inhabitants helps us precisely to look at the layer of individual, at the layer of everyday life, and at the layer of individual agency to relate to or to distance themselves from the state actions that Harris and Myra talked about, the kind of the skin state or the states of residence policies.
Thank you, Alina. I've got a question for Myra and Harris. What conclusions can you draw from cases beyond Hungary and Russia? I apologize, this is a bit long, but it is all one question. What does research on, for example, China or Latin America on kin states tell us? Where can you place kinship politics such as those of Chechnya regarding its diaspora, different or similar to those of a sovereign state, any constraints, or the opposite? Latter case is particularly curious as the reciprocity there is quite negative from the recipient end, I believe.
Well, I think I kind of addressed, maybe after this question was asked, I said that at least I put my point out there that I don't think we use this framework often to talk about these dynamics that are actually analogous, not the same, obviously, but analogous analytically in other parts. And I mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, but Latin America would also, and especially in terms of indigenous rights and indigenous movements, would fit, some of the indigenous movements would fit that work. Deborah Yassar's work and so on and so forth could be seen from some of these. And they usually talk about them as transnational networks or trans-border communities or indigenous rights. So it's just there's a different language. But I would also argue, maybe to give something more satisfactory for the person who asked, in my framework, the differences are very much also endogenous to the geopolitical space that each part of the world inhabits. So Latin America, for example, for a long time was living under what was called Pax Americana. So for those of you who are, who remember those types of terms, in a way it meant that the United States kind of dealt with security issues there, especially in the Cold War, in a way that kept a lead over different things turning military or what have you. So that is a very different context for kin state politics, building on what Myra was trying to draw as a distinction. Than a context where suddenly we have a geopolitical shift of gigantic tectonic, proportions. Obviously, in such a change, geopolitical change and transition, my prediction would be you find a lot more militarized, if you want, kin state politics than in more geopolitically stable, but not necessarily for good reason, stable areas, right? It could be just because you're a backyard of a great power that you're stable. So this is a way I would initially start trying to look at patterns, and that's what I do in the paper. And I can send it to Dr. Kish, I think is the person who asked this question. I would love to get comments. Yeah, I'll find your email.
Yeah, no, thank you. I guess, I was struck by Harris's comment. Just kind of a reminder that, again, this kin state framework is, well, maybe unsurprisingly, very state centric. And there are many places around the world where you have important sort of cross-border politics and identities, but doesn't necessarily, fall into our sort of European generated conceptual framework of kin state politics. So I think, that's an interesting point of kind of what we do there. I think, my use at different points in time of kind of a broader diaspora politics framework has been a way to try to get around some of that, but I don't think it doesn't really get us to that territoriality and like Borderlands idea. So, maybe maybe one possibility is to swim in Alina's waters a little more and, to try and bring together what I think is a really interesting growing literature around borderland dynamics more broadly, right? So I think there's been more work between those two perspectives, but I think, maybe more of that would help illuminate some of these differences and like what we care about at certain points in time. But on the other hand, to some of the questions about, different cases and thinking about Russia more broadly too, right? This is one of the things that I wanted to address when I was thinking about this presentation, which is this kind of these two basic levels for me of kin state, which is one is kind of the potentiality, right? It's like having a state that has this national minority or this minority population in another country that it may or may not act on, right? As Harris, you were saying, like there's wide variation in that. And then the second part of like my definition and the thing I was trying to bring out, which is this idea of ongoing institutionalized cross-border relationship, right? And that's more about action and sort of intention and ongoing commitments. And so I'm not sure what to do with that, but I think it's interesting, right? So that's more about like is the state actually acting out of that potentiality? And is that an actual commitment of some type rather than, which, can vary widely, rather than a kind of discursive, just purely instrumentalized like narrative, right? And I'm not sure how to deal with that either, but I think, maybe that's focus on what different cross-border actions look like may help us branch out into more parts of the world. I think this was an implication of some of the things you were talking about, Harris, but sort of might address a more global utility of this, and also I guess reflects a little bit of my discomfort of what to do with a case like Russia, which I remember being at ASN conference panels the May before Euromaidan and all that, and having people who had just come back from doing fieldwork about ethnic Russians in Crimea who came back and said, yeah, we would love to have some of that stuff that like Hungary does, but like Moscow doesn't give a crap about us, like we've been basically ignored, right? So then to like move from that sort of what could be seen as a lack of a long-term institutionalized commitment, but then we also have things like Russia World. So I'm not sure what to do with that. I was just kind of putting that out as a as a problematic that I think also has real both empirical and sort of analytical implications. Anyway, I will give time for others.
Myra, I'm going to just sort of put out one quick additional point. We've got a question that what do you think might happen with respect to Ukraine becoming a member of the EU? Will that change the Romania-Hungary kin state relationship with Ukraine if Ukraine enters the EU?
I mean, probably not that much. I mean, it depends, right? I mean, it depends on, it's going to depend a lot on what a post-war Ukraine looks like, and what a post-war nationalizing process looks like, right? So, I think it would hopefully be a source of desecuritization, but we know that that doesn't completely get rid of that, particularly in a discursive level, that hasn't gotten rid of all the tensions between, for example, Hungary and Romania, although I think there's been space for that relationship to become normalized, as I was sort of talking about this kind of outsourcing of, okay, fine, you want to do all this stuff, like, okay, we'll wash our hands of it as long as we get a piece of the pie, or you kind of let us know what's going on, like we're okay with it. So maybe a normalization of that. But if there's a sort of post-war nationalization process that looks like it's sort of targeting Hungarians, or doesn't kind of, there aren't better diplomatic paths than there were, for example, around the controversy over the 2017 language law and things like that in Ukraine. And there, also depends on what the nature of the Hungarian government is, right? So, I mean, one would like to think that being in the EU would sort of normalize some of that. There'd be some pressure to not engage in highly sort of problematic nationalizing policies. But I don't think it would take away the issue, but hopefully it would create space for the normalization of those relations. I guess that's about as optimistic as I'm willing to be.
Thank you, Myra. We've got a question about if we could have some discussion about the differences between kin-state dynamics and mechanics of securitization in non-NATO post-Soviet states such as Moldova and Georgia in comparison to the Baltics. I can toss that out to Alina or Kristina, or both.
Yes, I mean, I'm not definitely an expert on that, but just a slight observation of differences between the Baltic states and Georgia, Moldova, and maybe to that extent also Ukraine when it comes to Russia's kin-state policies and destabilization of certain internal political arena. Then I think what, just to come to the previous question, in terms of what EU would do, or joining the EU of all of those countries would do, is to, I don't think that it will solve the kin-state issue, or it will solve the problem of the national minorities. I think that's the experience of the Baltic states, but it will create some kind of a stable framework within which those things can be discussed and negotiated. Currently with Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine is that there is no framework except the OSCE that has been completely paralyzed since I don't know when, since early 2000s, and it's not really working. So the OSCE as a platform for kin-state kin-state and minority and nationalizing state relations is not working. I mean, let's put it frankly, it's just a dead organization in that sense. And there is no other framework. So it makes Georgia and Moldova more vulnerable, much more vulnerable to the kin-state interventions compared to the Baltic states, exactly because there is some sort of international framework in place that holds the states and governments reliable also for their own actions towards the minority, but also gives them the geopolitical security that Georgia and Moldova don't have. So this is where we see how Russia's kin-state policies are strongly interrelated to the geopolitical security, which is not the case with maybe some other kin-state policies, not with Hungarian kin-state policy for that, because it's not irredentist. So in this sense, I think that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are in more geopolitical instability when it comes to the kin-state relations.
Alina, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I would say I'm not an expert on in terms of securitization, but I would largely agree with Kristina. I think securitization is broadly connected in general when we're talking about minorities, that minorities are represented as strangers, and this process of a stranger making is tightly linked with a nation building process. And this is not only for the Baltic states, for Ukraine or any other countries, but in much broader sense. But here, for the Baltic states and Moldova and Ukraine, we have also the kin-state, which complicates the matters even more, creates a sense of instability, as Kristina also talked, and it creates even less opportunity for the desecuritizing steps to occur. So there is more resistance on different layers happening, and so I think, yeah, this is quite a problematic area.
And we've got a question about relationships at the moment between Ukrainians and Russians in the Baltic states. When we're speaking about Russian-speaking community and the securitization and sense of belonging happening in the Baltic states, is there some differentiation?
Well, we have a significant, very large Ukrainian refugee community. I think Estonia is one of the countries per capita has received the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees. And it's interesting that I did not mention in my speech, but the Ukrainian refugees are becoming also securitized in the current election campaign that is happening in Estonia by the right-wing nationalist party, who calls them hidden Russians. So they are actually Russians who claim to be Ukrainians. So that you can see how this population, 60,000 of them actually, are becoming securitized by saying that the reception of Ukrainian refugees is also a security threat to Estonian state, because they are actually Russians and we don't know their intentions, and we should not accept them any longer. But the relationship between the Russian community in Estonia and the Ukrainian very much increased Ukrainian community is obviously much more multifaceted, because as Alina said, the Russian community is not just joined one big group of people with a similar views. They are very fragmented network of people with a very different views, and you have a very diverse approaches to the war and to the Ukrainians and acceptance of Ukrainian nation. So what we have more conflict is not even between Russians and Ukrainians, but more inside of the Russian community itself, which is very split over the issue of Ukraine, and especially the split is very visible of intergeneration between the generations. So you have young Russians or younger generations of Russians who are rather strongly pro-Ukrainian, and then you have those Russians who are born themselves in Russia or born in Soviet Union who have a different view. So you have intergenerational conflict inside of the families where the children do not speak to their parents any longer because they can't talk over the issue of Ukraine. And this is quite widespread among the Russian community. So in this sense, the conflict between Russians and Ukrainians, of course, exists as well, but even stronger conflict is between the generations among Russian population itself.
Kristina, we have a couple of questions about the role of Council of Europe, about protection of minorities, and about some of the questions about deportation or extradition to Russia, and what this means for minority rights and protection of minority rights.
Well, strictly legally speaking, none of the legal frameworks actually protects Russian Federation citizens because it does not consider them to be national minorities. Russian Federation citizens are third country nationals who by EU legal framework or the Council of Europe legal framework are considered migrants, and the national minority rights do not apply to them. So in this sense, they have very little, if any, protection from the current international framework. Interestingly, we had one incident where not a Russian citizen, but a stateless person was extradited to Russia. But this was incident in a way where Estonia could not possibly extradite a stateless person to Russia because this person does not have a Russian citizenship, but he was pushed basically to leave the country through the security forces. But I think this is definitely a violation of international law and also EU legal norms because this person was stateless. What is even more severe actually is Latvian case, because in Latvia, it's not the singular, because I guess in Estonia, we have so far free singular events of extradition, free persons have been extradited to Russia. In Latvia, you have a law adopted by the parliament, which says that all Russian Federation citizens residing permanently on the territory of Latvia need to prove that they speak Latvian language, and they need to prove their loyalty to the Latvian state. Unless they do that, they can be extradited to Russia. And this law was adopted last year in Latvian parliament, and by the 1st of September this year, everybody has to actually prove their loyalty to the Latvian state. And this is really a severe case, I think, that I'm afraid will be heavily on the agenda of the EU as well, because I think these people are born in Latvia and raised in Latvia, and currently they are actually under the law which might extradite them to the Russian Federation.
We have a couple of more questions, but Kristina, can I just follow on with that? Do you see any movement that might suggest that the so-called gray non-citizen passport holders or those who have citizenship of Russian Federation might have an opportunity to change their citizenship to Latvian or Estonian?
We have actually quite significant citizenship shift happening. Many Russian Federation citizens are applying for Estonian passports and giving up their Russian one. But the problem is here that Russia has stopped officially canceling Russian citizenship. So you can't basically leave Russian citizenship under the current law in Russia, which is another violation of international legal norms. But of course, Russia is not too much interested in that. So we have a political debate on that, because even if people would like to get Estonian citizenship, they cannot, because they cannot cancel their Russian one, and the dual citizenship is not allowed under the Estonian law. So this process is happening, but there is a legal issues here at stake.
Excellent. And we've got a couple of more questions, which I think could be combined into just a sort of a critical reconsideration of what a kin state looks like. Do we have a changing nature, non-fixed nature of kin state, for example? The example here is that in 2014, the discussion in Russia was about Novorossiya, and now it's obviously expanded to a larger concept of what is Russian lands, and how do we consider kin states for some of the interlocutor, for example, that Alina was speaking about, someone who has multiple realities. So some of these more expansive thinking about kin states. Harris, your name has been.
So, well, I mean, I think a little bit of what is happening, both at the Q&A and in our conversations, and maybe Zsuzsa is right, we should do like a special issue on this issue, an extra one. We are starting with different ontological understandings of this. So when I call a state a kin state, I don't necessarily mean it in a good or a bad way or in any normative way, right? So we're describing whether a state fits the type of behavior that we think is actually behavior of that thing we call a kin state, right? So when Putin wrote that long, weird article on how Ukrainians and Russians are one people and so on and so forth, like a year before the invasion almost, he was acting as a kin state wannabe, at least. You know, he was continuing on that line, going back to some of the questions that were in the Q&A. I'm just bringing it up. Now, whether he genuinely believed it or not, that's a different type of question, right? Similarly, in other concepts that I've worked on, like the Fifth Columns book that I have recently published, you know, do people believe, when they scapegoat people, do they actually believe the things, the vitriol and the things they spill about different groups that they're being marginalized or discriminated against? Do they actually believe those things they're saying, or do they just do it for strategic reasons? That doesn't undo the fact that they're treated as a fifth column. So I would leave it at that. It's just an analytical category. Calling something kin state doesn't legitimate it, in my eyes at least, any more than calling it something else. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
I would be interested to know if Myra agrees with that. I don't know how she thinks about it ontologically.
I mean, I guess we're almost out of time. We have to give Zsuzsa her wrap up minute here, but I mean, I would agree generally. Like, I don't think it legitimizes, although I think, again, and this is sort of a moving target in my own brain, I think I'm moving towards focus on the second part of my broad definition, where like we actually need to find a way to talk about actions, like, so that I think we can talk about a kin state discourse, but I think we then also need to look at what is actually happening. Like, what are they actually doing? And does this have, even if it's problematic in many of the ways that I've written about, does it have some resonance? Like, what does the partnership like on the ground look like, right? You know, and how is this interacting with a more complex, nuanced borderland set of identities and realities? So yeah, I mean, yeah, anyway, so maybe we have to look at
just a clarification. I think what we could say is that a state could act on the discourse of kin states without actually acting in favor of the kin state they're claiming. So that's still using the terms without necessarily morally making a point.
Well,
about, right. So,
maybe we say they're using a kin state discourse, but we hold on actually categorizing them as an active kin state.
I completely agree.
Doing any of the things.
So
anyway,
that's a modification that actually we don't talk about fifth. We talk about fifth column politics rather. So maybe if you talk about kin state politics, you're suggesting actually that this is politics. It's not necessarily as genuine or reciprocated as it may be assumed. That's what I think is.
Maybe, although politics also shapes policies. But anyway, okay.
True.
That might begin to resolve part of our problem with how to conceptualize Russia as well. What a wonderful, wonderful conversation, Zsuzsa.
Thank you very much. I just came back to thank everyone on the panel for this really terrific, nuanced conversation that was interactive. And I think thoughts were going on, and maybe even changes in the way we are thinking about these concepts and this field, which, to go back to Brubaker's approach, is an interactive relational field, the cross-border field in which there are actors and politics and and multiple memberships, as Myra is thinking about that, and multiple realities, as Alina has mentioned. And so I'd like to thank you for all of that. And I do want to put in a word for our audience to take a look at the call for papers, which is out for the ASN's first post-pandemic European conference that is going to happen in Cluj. And I am going to put, I hope, the link for that, for the call for papers, in the chat. But if you just Google ASN Cluj 2023, it should come up. And I hope you also know that the ASN's convention is back in person. It will be at the Herman Institute, where we always meet. And I hope that you can make it, and that we can go back to both in-person meetings and conferencing, and also continuing this virtual platform, which connects us during conventions and also provides a pillar, also provides a possibility for us to go more global when we want, and address questions that affect not just the ASN's traditional regions, but also more comparatively other regions, and discuss big questions. And thank you, Harris, also for putting in nationalities papers links. It's very, very important to always keep that in mind, that nationalities papers is the ASN's very successful scholarly journal, of which Harris Mylonas is the editor-in-chief, and we always invite good manuscripts to that. So thank you very much, and see you back soon. Take care.